together towards solutions that are just and harmonious. Ya Allah, Ya Rabb, guide our leaders with your divine wisdom. Inspire them to seek peaceful resolutions and to prioritize the well-being of their people over conflict. Instill in them the courage to pursue diplomacy and mutual respect for the citizens of both nations. We ask for peace, we ask for patience and empathy. Help us to see beyond borders and to recognize our shared humanity. May we all contribute to a future where peace prevails and where our differences are celebrated rather than feared. O Allah, unite our hearts and make us instruments of your peace. Let us be the bridge that connects rather than a wall that divides. Encourage us to engage in constructive dialogue and to build relationships based on trust and respect. As we gather here today, we commit ourselves, Ya Allah, to the path of peace and understanding. With your guidance, O Allah, may we overcome the challenges before us and emerge stronger and more united. Wa akhiru da'wana an alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the representatives of the Christian community and the Muslim community. I want to welcome you again on behalf of the Center of International and Border Studies. I am Mark Curtin, and I currently serve as the director. We established this institution, this organization, just about a year ago at this venue. And we saw as important a commitment to evidence-based and data-driven research on issues both international and regional. And also, we will establish a firm commitment to look at issues related to borders, and especially the current controversy between Guyana and Venezuela. Quite recently, we have, in collaboration with the Cipriani College of Labor of Trinidad and Tobago, we also established a series of, or we proposed a series of meetings and sensitization events, because we've noticed an information deficit, both in relation to the people of Guyana and those in the hemisphere. We have pledged also to ensure that the deliberations are not only from this side of the podium, but must have the participation and interventions from the audiences both online and on site. We would want to also recognize that there are several new issues that have emerged. And in this increasingly complex regional geopolitical environment, we also feel that your contributions could make significant, or you can make significant contributions to clear understanding of the controversy. As you know, in recent times, there's been an escalation in the aggressive action by Venezuela. In the recent weeks, we've had military personnel being injured by armed Venezuelans. We've had a naval vessel from Venezuela encroaching on our exclusive economic zone. And then there's, not insignificantly, the decision by Venezuela to hold an election for a governor of what they term Guyana Essequibo, which has never been Venezuelan territory, and we see these events as important, and we want to ensure that with the panel that we have invited, we can interrogate these issues and to bring some clear understanding to some of the issues which we see as important. To start today's program, we will have a presentation from Dr. Riyad Insenali, who is a former ambassador of Guyana to the United States and a representative to the OAS. He has a PhD from Harvard University and now is also a fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium in the United States. We feel that his contribution could add to the discourse on the issue. And I want to ask Dr. Insenali to make his presentation using the electronic platform that we have available. Dr. Insenali.
Thank you, Mark. Are you hearing me well? Right. Good evening, everyone, and thanks to the Center for International Border Studies, and in particular, thanks to Dr. Mark Curtin for the kind invitation to participate on this distinguished panel. I am only sorry that I can't be home to be there with you in Georgetown in person, but I will do my best to present virtually. In this presentation, I will try to focus on some of the diplomatic aspects of Guyana's response to Venezuela's continuous and escalating series of provocations. Recently, there's been a lot of commentary on the need to boost our military capacity to defend our country against Venezuelan incursions, or, perish the thought, outright invasion. Some analysts have maintained the traditional posture that diplomacy must remain our first line of defense, given the obvious imbalance in military might between Guyana and Venezuela. Then there's a more nuanced line that diplomacy is not worth that much without a credible military option. This leads us to the question, whose military? Ours? Brazil's? CARICOM's? The United States? I am not a military expert, but I would suggest to you that even if we were to devote the money and resources necessary to building up the Guyana Defense Force, it would be some time before it was capable of deterring the clear and present danger posed by the rogue regime in Caracas and its armed forces. And absent any sort of defense treaty with anyone, there can be no assumption of an automatic response by a friendly country, no matter how well disposed towards us it might be. Yet, just yesterday, we heard US Secretary of State Marco Rubio say very clearly, I quote, "It will be a very bad day for the Venezuelan regime if they were to attack Guyana or attack ExxonMobil, and it would not end well for them." End of quote. This was followed by the signing of an MOU by Foreign Minister Hugh Todd and Secretary Rubio to address shared security challenges, including military-to-military cooperation. Details in this respect are, for obvious reasons, confidential, but this is particularly significant in the context of the Venezuelan threat. Earlier yesterday, there was also the use of the GDF's joint maritime exercises with the US Navy in international waters and in Guyana's exclusive economic zone. I regard these developments as a welcome demonstration of support by the United States, which has become our preeminent strategic partner. Presumably, as Guyana works to strengthen its security stance in partnership with the United States, it is also looking to other friendly nations for support. I consider the unequivocal support of the United States as a triumph of our diplomacy and a personal triumph for President Ali, who has been at the forefront of our diplomatic efforts. And before anyone asks about the quid pro quo, let me clarify that diplomacy is more often than not about identifying a convergence of interests and building strategic alliances based on the mutuality of interests. At this particular juncture, Guyana, with its huge oil and gas reserves, is of great geoeconomic importance to the United States as a source of cheap and reliable energy, as recognized by Secretary Rubio yesterday. Moreover, the exploitation of our hydrocarbons is being led by a consortium 75% owned by US corporations. Finally, the social, political, and economic turmoil that the Maduro regime has inflicted on Venezuela is a cause for instability that threatens not only Guyana as a neighbor, but also the whole region, which the US regards either as its backyard or its third border. These are the interests that Guyana's diplomacy has been leveraging and must continue to leverage vis-a-vis the United States. There can be no room for complacency. We cannot be focused on the US alone, however, since we are well aware that some of their geopolitical concerns do not square with our diversity of diplomatic and economic relations. Just consider Mr. Rubio's statement in Suriname about the quality of our roads, mistakenly attributed to the Chinese. If you want to get a sense of other US interests that might not fit into the convergence theory. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in dangerous and turbulent times. The international rules-based order and multilateral diplomacy are under siege. Global geopolitics is undergoing a seismic shift, the likes of which we have not witnessed since the lead up to World War II. Transactional negotiations and bullying are undermining traditional notions of diplomacy and alliance building. Might is right. These are dangerous and turbulent times for the world as a whole, but more so for countries in asymmetrical relationships. Guyana is and has always been in such a relationship with Venezuela. Over the course of the border controversy, with no military power to compete with our larger neighbor to the west, with limited economic means until the advent of oil and gas, and with relatively little geopolitical relevance for our first 50 years as an independent state, Guyana has had to rely on diplomacy to hold its own against our more powerful neighbor. That we have been able to do so, and even punch above our weight at times, says a lot about the quality of our diplomacy over the years. Now, as an emerging petrostate and as a responsible member of the regional family and the international community, sitting next door to a country in freefall, Guyana has acquired unprecedented geoeconomic and geostrategic significance. This may be what has aroused Mr. Maduro's ire. But in escalating Venezuelan hostility to the point of sending a warship to threaten offshore assets in the Stabroek Block in Guyana's EEZ on March 1st, he appears to have miscalculated. Guyana's diplomatic response was immediate, securing strong statements of support from CARICOM and the international community, including Canada, France, the UK, the USA, and the Secretaries General of the Commonwealth and the OAS. The United States in particular minced no words, stating, I quote, further provocation will result in consequences for the Maduro regime, end of quote. Since then, taking into account the reimposition of US sanctions on Venezuela, the withdrawal of the license for Chevron to operate in Venezuela, and the pressure on Venezuela to accept deportees from the US, it seems that the US is returning to the first Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure. I suggest to you that support for Guyana currently fits neatly into this policy. Conscious of the time and the fact that there are 5 other panelists, and looking ahead to the Q&A, I would like to put before you 3 questions and points for further consideration. The first one, why has Maduro decided to escalate provocations and tensions further? I believe that Maduro's posturing and the planned elections in May are mainly for domestic consumption, with little prospect of an actual invasion. He is trying to rally support around the flag on a deeply nationalistic issue before the farce of the elections for the governor of the so-called Guyana Essequiba. Unfortunately, his revolutionary rhetoric and downright insulting references to President Ali aren't confined to within Venezuela, but he seems not to care as to what might be the unintended consequences of his words and actions. Maduro's reference to President Ali as the Zelensky of the Caribbean may offer a further clue into his thinking. Maduro might have been emboldened by President Zelensky's disastrous meeting with President Trump and the sense that the United States would be unlikely to get involved in a neighborhood spat far removed from America's borders. But the threat to ExxonMobil's operations was clearly a step too far, as reflected in the robust position taken by Secretary Rubio yesterday. After comparing President Ali to Zelensky, Maduro seems to have been ironically unaware that most of the world views the latter as a hero. And as Sir Ronald Sanders has asked rhetorically, if Ali is the Zelensky of the Caribbean, who is the Putin? My second question I would put to you is, how strong is CARICOM's position with regard to Venezuela's actions? I think that the CARICOM statement coming out of the Barbados Intersessional meeting in February was the strongest one yet in response to Venezuelan aggression, expressing grave concern over Maduro's intention to elect a governor of Essequibo and urging Venezuela not to carry out these elections or intrude in any other way in Guyana's sovereign territory. CARICOM heads also condemned the February 17th attack on members of the GDF. Unfortunately, CARICOM's position did not serve to give pause to further Venezuelan provocations, as we saw on March 1st. And notwithstanding CARICOM's repeated, I quote, unequivocal and unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Guyana, end of quote, and the immediate response to the March 1st incident, there were a few worrying nuances. Why in the very first line of this statement was the incursion into Guyana's EEZ referred to as an interaction with one of the oil platforms? This was no friendly encounter. It was a calculated violation of Guyana's maritime area and an unnecessary provocation, in addition to being in breach of international law and the Argyll Agreement, as was recognized in the statement. And why the excessively cautious diplomatic language in enjoining both Guyana and Venezuela to avoid unnecessary confrontational actions, and the call for patience, calm, and non-provocation on both sides? Ladies and gentlemen, there is no record of Guyanese confrontation with or provocation of Venezuela. There is no justification for balancing alarm at Venezuela's actions and support for Guyana with calls to Guyana to play nicely. I continue to fail to understand how those who champion the Argyll process believe that Maduro is genuinely interested in honoring the commitments he gave. His bluster and threats need to be addressed. He is the aggressor, and Venezuela is the threat to peace. Even in diplomacy, one does not appease a bully. In this respect, I am pleased to note the robust stance taken by President Ali in declaring himself open to dialogue, but refusing to countenance Maduro's request for a meeting in the framework of Argyll, given Venezuela's outright hostility to Guyana and Maduro's personal insults directed at President Ali. There can be no room for high-level diplomacy when one party is so blatantly offensive and aggressive. My final question, what more can Guyana do? Until the attack on the GDF patrol on February the 17th and the March 1st maritime incursion, Guyana's diplomacy was quite measured, limited to calling in the Venezuelan ambassador in Georgetown to the foreign ministry, issuing diplomatic notes of protest, and apprising international organizations and the ICJ of Venezuela's actions. This is perhaps a reflection of the confidence of the government in the merits of its case at the ICJ, and a certain degree of satisfaction that it had enough US support to tread softly in the face of the most outrageous border provocations. But as I have argued along with Greg Quinn, former British High Commissioner to Guyana, in an article published by Global Americans, there is need for more robust diplomacy, such as we have been witnessing since March the 1st. Guyana should now further escalate the matter, diplomatically of course, highlighting the threat Venezuela poses to international peace and security. Guyana must again put this matter before the UN Security Council, of which Guyana is currently a non-permanent member, as it did in April 2024, to protest Venezuela's actions aimed at annexing the Essequibo region. Let me be clear. We are not advocating a different means of settlement because Venezuela refuses to recognize the jurisdiction of the ICJ. Rather, we believe that recourse to the UNSC is necessary in light of Venezuela's continued provocations and defiance of international law. The UNSC would then be in a position to insist that Venezuela abide by the process selected by the UN Secretary General and the rulings of the ICJ. At the very least, it would show its desire for this issue to be settled by the body most relevant to doing so, that is, the ICJ. Guyana must also continue to engage diplomatically with its other friends, such as Brazil and the growing number of Latin American countries interested in closer relations with us. And if we are not already doing so, we must enlist the support of our friends who are particular friends of Venezuela's, namely China, Cuba, and perhaps Russia, although the temptation for the latter to sow mischief in America's backyard might be too strong. Guyana needs to use all the diplomatic tools at its disposal, including public diplomacy, and must maintain a diplomatic offensive aimed at the international community as a whole. The message to Venezuela must be clear. Bad and illegal behavior will not be tolerated. Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much for sharing those perspectives, Dr. Intanali. And we look forward to your participation in the Q&A sessions that will follow. When we were planning this event, we approached the Government and International Affairs Department of the University of Guyana because we saw the need for a student perspective. And they readily agreed and have nominated or selected this young man, Mr. Damien Denny, International Relations final year student, to present his perspective. So, Mr. Denny.
All protocols previously observed. Good evening, everyone. All right, so my name is Daniel Denny, and I'm a final year student at the University of Guyana. And I'm here to present to you from a youth perspective on the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy. Now, as young people, we see the issue as a political dispute, but not as a political dispute, but as a challenge to our national identity, economic future, and regional stability. Now, the controversy is seen as an attack on Guyana's sovereignty, heritage, culture, and economy. We, the youth, see the 1899 arbitral award settled the country's border between Venezuela. Hence, their claims are unjustified. But what does this mean to young people? Not only Guyana's oil wealth, but our rich natural resources lie in the heart of the Essequibo. The Essequibo makes up approximately 2/3 of Guyana's national sovereign territory. Along with oil, we have the abundance of gold, diamond, magnesium, timber resources. We also have pristine sites like Shell Beach, and ecotourism sites such as Kaitro Falls and Iroquois. Therefore, losing the Essequibo region would hamper Guyana's national development and will put a dent on our culture and heritage as a sovereign nation and as a people, which would in turn disappropriately impact young people also. Young people deserve the right to benefit from Guyana's resources, not lose them to our neighborly bullies. Now, what are the thoughts and our responses and ideas for improvement? Historically, we have embraced diplomatic means, as Mr. Insinali has just elaborated on, working with our neighbors, friends, and allies through international organizations. And we need to continue to embrace this approach. Prioritizing national defense through increased budget allocations, with focus on recruitment plus wholesale adoption of new technology might be a course of action. Guyana is a small territory in comparison to Venezuela. And more so, we hold a much smaller population in comparison. It might be a good idea to embrace technology as a monitoring mechanism to our sovereign borders. Now, a number of strategies have worked thus far, but we need to take it up to another level, involving all stakeholders in building national position at every step of the way. There's the need for this approach to be sustained, not only in times of heightened tensions, but in times of calm relations. Schools, and when we say schools at all levels, from nursery to tertiary, should incorporate lessons on the country's history, including the defense of our territory. We should embrace digital engagement. Today's young people, we embrace technology in every aspect of our lives. So podcasts, debates, workshops, storytelling, animation are some tools that we can use to engage the younger generation. But how can young people contribute? Understanding every dimension of the territorial controversy, from the historic to present, legal, economic impact are a way to start. Spreading awareness via social media and advocating for coordinated youth positions, creating youth groups to engage in national debates about short, medium, and long-term responses to this dispute. Working with youth organizations and schools to build national pride and patriotism. Enrolling in military service to safeguard national borders also. Finally, let me conclude by saying the territorial controversy is about our past, present, and more importantly, the future. We as young people must educate ourselves to speak up and take action on this territorial controversy. Essequibo belongs to Guyana, and we will defend it with our national patrimony. I thank you for having me this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Denny, for sharing your perspectives on the issue. Our next presenter is retired Ambassador Sherwin Miles, who headed the Frontiers Division of Guyana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1978 to 1985, became Guyana's ambassador to Venezuela in 1985, from 1985 to 1992. Also, the Director General of the Guyana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1992 to 1999, and from 1999 to 2008 as Guyana's ambassador to Brazil. Again, she reassumed duties as ambassador of Guyana to Venezuela between 2015 and 2019. Ambassador Miles will undoubtedly bring some of our experiences, both in Brazil and Venezuela, and I therefore invite Ambassador Miles to present remotely.
Greetings, everyone. I hope I'm heard. My voice is not very loud, so let's hope it works, the mic works. Greetings to my fellow panelists. Greetings, Mark. Greetings to audience, both overseas and in Guyana. Sorry I can't be there in person, but you know, it's something that can't be helped. As others have said, the subject matter here is of immense importance to Guyana, to Venezuela. One of my Venezuelan friends should be online. Hello, Milos. Hope that you can understand all the English. And to the region as a whole. And in fact, given the butterfly effect trope, this is a subject of significance to the world as a whole. As Mark has said, I am retired from government service. So let me start with a disclaimer. What I'm going to share with you is a reflection of my personal opinions and views. Personal. I will be as honest and forthright as I can, bearing in mind that diplomats always keep some particular issues close to their chest or in their back pocket. My perspective on the controversy has been honed by many years of diplomatic involvement, as Mark described in a short summary, in South America and in the Caribbean. It's quite strange because in my international relations program, when I was studying, I focused on African unity. And of course, that means that when you come into your any kind of work, you put into something totally different. But that's the will of God. I visited all 12 sovereign states of South America in an official capacity. The only one I haven't been to is France, French Guyana. During the course of these perambulations, and as I participated in regional meetings, it struck me, and it struck me at times quite forcefully, that Guyana and possibly Suriname, I don't know, I can't speak for any other country, but possibly Suriname, we are regarded as anomalies, isn't it? States that have obtained political independence in the recent past, small in size and population, of ethnicities and cultures that vary from the regional norm, non-Spanish speaking. All these factors combine to make us unique and perhaps somewhat puzzling members of the club. Bear with me. I want you to understand a little bit of the region in which we are placed. It makes a difference, a context to how we are dealing with Venezuela and how Venezuela deals with us. So let me share one small anecdote. I recall presenting my credentials in a South American country which shall be nameless, and listening with amazed horror or horrified amazement as the band played a national anthem I'd never heard before. I didn't know what had gone wrong. You know, we had sent the tapes, we'd sent the score. So had they mixed us up with some other country? And as I stood there, you know, at attention to what seemed like the wrong anthem, all these thoughts were going through my mind. But as he escorted me to the credentials room, the chief of protocol beamed at me. "Did you like it?" he asked. "We changed the arrangement because the tune was so plain." I was speechless. I had no words. On another occasion, second anecdote, and in another country, during an informal get-together after a meeting, my counterpart leaned in with a question. "Tell me," he said, "do you know what you're going to say when you ask for the floor?" So surprised, I nodded. "Well, yes, I do." "Well," he continued, "we don't. We ask for the floor and we start talking until we work out what we want to say. Sometimes I think you guys are laughing at us." That's when I realized that cultural mannerisms vary, and that people like Guyana, Guyanese coming from an English-speaking country in a South American culture can sometimes cause offense unwittingly when interacting with people from a completely different background. I took that message to heart. So, colleagues working in Venezuela, because of the extant controversy, I received considerable attention from the host government during my postings to Venezuela. I want to stress and emphasize that at no time was I negotiating with regard to finding a solution to the controversy. That was not my job. My job was to maintain cordial relations, to promote functional cooperation, to protect the interests of Guyanese residents in Venezuela, while at the same time defending Guyana's position. That might sound, a fairly simple situation, but it is not. It's quite a complex situation. During both postings, I experienced challenging moments because of political and social turbulence in Venezuela. I recall that during my first tour, as Mark said, that was between 1985 and 1992, my children were with me. We went as a family. And there was a riot. Carlos Andres Perez raised the price of gas, and that had a flash riot that broke. It was horrifying because my eldest son was actually working at an English language newspaper in Venezuela, the Daily Journal, which is in downtown Caracas, where all these things were happening, burning of tires, shots fired. So as my child, my husband and I jumped into the official car and raced to his rescue, brought him back safely. It's a good thing sometimes to go to a post when you are fairly young, that was at that time, because you don't have the same kind of feelings that you have as a more mature person. So although it was exciting, I can't say that I was really scared. When I returned to Caracas, 2015, the end of 2015 until 2019, that was an entirely different situation. It was a circumstance where there was more than civil unrest, battles in the street. It was quite amazing. There were days we could not go to work, we couldn't leave the house. There were days when we were at the embassy and found it difficult to return home. It was about a half-hour journey between the residence in Caracas and where the embassy was located. And there were times that it took me almost 4 hours to return home because we could not use the highways. We had to go through the mountains, through the barrios, what they call the green route, to be able to get back home. It was unnerving, to say the least. But I don't think that I felt, or the embassy felt, directly threatened because I was the ambassador of Guyana. It wasn't like that. Everyone was suffering the same situation, except for one occasion when the embassy received a bomb threat. That was the first time that I heard my counterpart in the foreign ministry screaming on the phone. He was really terrified that something could have happened, and not to the ambassador of Guyana on his watch. Anyway, nothing happened. They came, they took swift measures to ensure safety. So, the nature of living in turbulent situations in Venezuela. I'm sure we've all seen it on the movies. Well, we've seen it on television, we have heard about it, but it's another thing to actually live the experience. It is extremely difficult situation to go through. So, that part. Maintaining cordial relations with Venezuelans in Venezuela. Let me say from the outset that among the Latin American, South American countries, Venezuelans are one of the most pleasant people that you can find. Very easy to get on with, very cordial. You know, there was one official visit, as I go on to say, that happened quite frequently. And there was always dancing. You know, there was one particular circumstance when the foreign minister of Guyana visited Venezuela, official capacity. And after the formal meetings, there was what you would call like a sport, dancing, music. And I think the one thing that struck me most is that the guards that were assigned to the foreign minister took off their weapons and the dance floor also. I want to explain this to you so you know that, you know, in a region, these are people who can be pleasant, agreeable, delightful, charming, but there's the elephant in the room. One never gets used to seeing Venezuelan maps with 2/3 of Guyana as a tail, as an appendage. And this was particularly distressing for me when on show in the offices of friendly countries, you know, they would say to me, well, you know, that's the only map we can get. Put up, and we say, here in Venezuela. I said, but yes, but you can purchase the map overseas, not difficult. They just had not taken the trouble to do it. And it should be noted that such visual misrepresentation, when seen every day, is sure to have a psychological effect on the viewer. It's an image that speaks more eloquently than anything Venezuela can say in support of its claim. And you know, if thinking of the people who have spoken before me have spoken about what should be done, diplomatic efforts. That's one thing that really we need to do, is to have our map out there, because that speaks to you. That's what tells you what you are. Also, I'm not sure what's happening now. I'm not in this service, but when I was in the ministry and in overseas and post, we had to be extremely vigilant in terms of regional and extra-regional meetings to be sure that the map that was displayed was the map that we know shows the borders between Guyana and Venezuela, the proper borders. And if you did not, that map with the little appendage would suddenly appear. That Venezuela is extremely good at its propaganda efforts, extremely good. We have got to be better. So during my first time in Caracas, there was a lot of functional cooperation, a lot of visits by ministers, a lot of presidential diplomacy. President Hoyt visited. President Lucinchi came to Guyana. President Carlos Andres Perez came to Guyana. And although I'd left post by then, I was on the delegation that accompanied President Xi Jinping when he went to Venezuela in 1993. A lot of interaction. Those were the days of the good officer process, which I won't go into, but that was a way of hoped to de-escalate the situation and possibly find a solution. It did not work, as we know. The above litany of visits and cooperation programs that went on in accordance with those visits stands in stark contrast to the strained relations between Guyana and Venezuela during my second posting. It actually required a meeting of Presidents Granger and Maduro, the Secretary General Guterres, before relations were normalized to the extent that I was approved. My appointment was approved by President Maduro. I arrived in Venezuela end of 2015, presented my copies to Foreign Minister Delcy Rodriguez in February of 2016. That occasion was not something for the faint-hearted. I was kept waiting for hours in the Casa Maria Foreign Ministry, while an increasingly desperate chief of protocol offered an array of refreshments to me and my delegate. Most of the things he offered weren't actually available because of the intense shortages, but his heart was in the right place. Before the actual ceremony, there was a display of diplomatic aggression in the form of speeches by military and political figures to an assembled audience. Anniversary of the signing of the Geneva Agreement, 1966. Personally, I quite enjoyed what seemed like a pappy show, thundering. My husband and my deputy chief of mission were sitting behind me, and I could literally feel the waves of fury that were emanating from them as the threats and the shouting and the rhetoric continued. The actual presentation was a very pleasant and courteous affair. Foreign Minister Delcy and I played our role to perfection. I handed over a copy of an anthology of poems by Martin Carter, which had been translated into Spanish, as my gift. It seemed appropriate. Revolutionary poetry. In return, I received a painting of Hugo Chavez. But I felt I was in for a rough ride in posting this time around. Nevertheless, I may have passed some kind of test. When I began my round of diplomatic polls, after presenting my letters formally to President Maduro, the reactions were friendly and receptive. And I want to stress in general that, wherever we have diplomats, in whatever post we have diplomats, this is something that I'm sure is known, but it's good to reiterate it at a forum like this. It doesn't matter what country you're in. Your job is to meet the diplomatic community and to present your country's position. But in Venezuela, it was particularly important because the diplomatic colleagues there were subject to all the propaganda of Venezuela about Venezuela basis. And this was my only means of trying to counter. The most significant support in Venezuela, and goes back to Riyadh's point, came from the CARICOM group. At that time, it was a very active CARICOM group under the skillful chairmanship of the ambassador of Barbados. And it was supportive. We shared information, we shared data, we shared our views, because we weren't all of the same views. We had different views with relations to Venezuela, but we held one front with regard to the controversy with Guyana. It was somewhat of a strange disconnect because at that time, my point of contact with the Foreign Ministry of Venezuela was the Vice Minister for Latin America. And their point of contact was the Vice Minister for CARICOM. So there were two vice ministers. It worked to our advantage because, we could find out a little bit more about workings and what was going on, because there were two people that we were dealing with on a surprisingly, perhaps, in the face of how I started this diplomatic effort the second time around, it was relatively easy to speak with foreign ministry officials and from time to time with the foreign minister. On this occasion, I didn't have the access to Miraflores Palace as I had in my first postings, and perhaps that was a good thing in hindsight. But the lines of communication were kept open. I'm sure we all recall the incident, or perhaps we don't, in December 2018, the seismic vessel, the Ramform Tessis, my pronunciation is correct, was accosted together with other vessels while doing seismic work in the Stabroek Block by the Venezuelan Navy. This was just before Christmas, December 22nd, 2018. I hand-delivered my protest note to the foreign ministry. Now, if you know anything about Latin America, South America, people don't work over Christmas. The building empty except for a security guard and one senior official. He told me very resentfully that the vice minister had ordered him to receive me.
You forget your belt?
And
Yeah.
the poor man was unable to go and enjoy his family Christmas outside Caracas because he had to be in the foreign ministry to receive the note from the ambassador of Guyana. I hope this gives you an idea of what it's like to be in post. It's kind of surreal, you know, friendly people, pleasant people, revolutionary people, but people, you know, the revolutionary aspect is tempered because a lot of people are also, you know, very Catholic. So you will go into an office and the persons there are telling you, you know, what good revolutionaries they are, and if anyone comes to attack them, they're going to take to the streets with their rifles. But they have a, you know, an image of the Archangel Michael in the room at the same time. So it's surreal to be there to understand it. Thoughts on the way forward. I hope that this kind of discussion kind of leads to a situation where in a meeting of minds, we can begin to think about what is the best way forward. But I have some comments, I would say, questions/comments. Guyana is currently facing, as everyone knows, a series of concerted efforts by Venezuela to promote its claim, even in the most outlandish and dangerous of ways. The United States, as explained by Riyad Insinali, has reiterated and emphasized its position that it will not tolerate active aggression on the part of Venezuela. But actually, it's said on the part of the Maduro regime. That's an important thing to note. Venezuela is well aware of this. President Maduro is well aware of this. He's been aware of this for a long time. But he is still behaving in this way. The regime is still behaving in this way. It leads one to wonder, does it want to provoke a conflict situation? Does it want to push the situation? Or does it feel that even though countries might say that they're going to do something, it has to be really egregious before they will act. And they don't plan to be egregious. They plan to take in a step-by-step approach. I don't know. It's a question. What does it have to gain? Where is it going? Venezuela has stated categorically it will not engage Guyana at the ICJ, that the ICJ has no jurisdiction on the controversy. yet it has engaged counsel and it submits its memorials. I was told when I was in Caracas that we are not going to go to the ICJ, but if we were to go, we are prepared. Again, this is a surreal situation. Venezuela has mired itself in political crisis after crisis for years. When I arrived in Caracas, the dinner party, cocktail party conversation was that it would be a matter of months before the regime fell. Yet it continues to cling to power. So what is it? What's the end game here? How is this happening? Right on our doorstep, next to us. Venezuela is a large and wealthy country with the world's largest oil reserves. As an official once told me at dinner, Guyana's reserves are like a wine glass compared to Venezuela's big water pitcher. The point is then, why do they want our wine glass? What difference does it make to them? Yet with size and wealth, it's ramped up its territorial claim. Is this only saber rattling? I know this is the perceived wisdom, but I believe that there might be more in the mortar than the pestle. I confess that I don't have the answers to these and other imponderables. But as I wrote this, as I made this presentation, as I thought about it over the last few days, I'm wondering if I'm seeing a similarity here to Venezuela's sudden revival of its claim as Guyana approached political independence. Currently, Guyana is developing its resources and rapidly evolving. Currently, Guyana is awaiting the decision of the ICJ, which is likely to be in its favor. Currently, Guyana is on the cusp of becoming an important hub, a player in Latin America and the region. Is it possible that Venezuela is losing its last opportunity to bring or to force Guyana to the negotiating table for bilateral conversations on the future of Essequibo? Could that be one of the reasons? Because as you know, that has been the interpretation that Venezuela has given of the Geneva Agreement, particularly in the Maduro regime, that bilateral relations, bilateral discussions, negotiations is what is the only reason for the Geneva Agreement being signed. They ignore everything else and they zone in on that. That's where they can exercise maximum pressure. So is this kind of stomping and carrying on, and is it a way of trying to push us to a situation where we are going to say, let's talk about it? Up to now, this has not happened, but is this what is going on in the minds of the regime? I don't know. And colleagues, friends, Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, inter alia, prohibits the threat or use of force by member states against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. Riyadh has talked about going back to the United Nations Security Council about this. What I think is something that perhaps has not been fully realized unless you are Guyanese living in Guyana or involved in assisting in the diplomatic efforts of Guyana, is the effect of a threat. It's something that even our CARICOM colleagues who are not next door, the neighbor, do not really understand. You have to live it to know it. And that's one of the reasons I think it's put into the charter. Threat, the actual threat that exists, that inhibits people from doing what they should do, inhibits people live in the border areas, they have that feeling of something hanging over their heads. This, I think, is something that we need to try to emphasize at the diplomatic level. Power of a threat. When I addressed the Summit of Non-Aligned Countries in Venezuela in 2016, that's something that I emphasized in my presentation, and I haven't changed my mind. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Miles, for sharing your historical experiences with us. As we move quickly along, we have invited Professor Paulo Gustavo Correa of the Federal University of Amapá, based in Macapá, Brazil, the state that borders French Guyana. Professor Correa is a professor of international relations and the coordinator of the border studies program of that university, and is keenly interested and has done significant research in the area. I want to welcome Professor Correa and say to him in Portuguese, é grande prazer ter você conosco mais uma vez em evento sobre fronteiras. It's my pleasure to ask you, Professor Paulo, to address us this evening.
Thank you very much, Mark. You are a very good friend and a good colleague, and it's always such a pleasure to be part of an event that you hold. Good evening, everyone. Today I will be discussing a little bit about the impact of the escalating crisis between Venezuela and Guyana, focusing on different perspectives, but most importantly, Brazil's role on this complex regional dynamic. Over the two past decades, Brazil's relationship with Venezuela has undergone significant transformation, shaped by political shifts and the regional challenge. From the strategic partnership under Lula and Chavez to diplomatic rupture during Bolsonaro's and Maduro's administrations, and now accusations of re-engagement under Lula's return, this changing dynamic have had direct implications for South America stability. Well, in this short presentation, I will explore the key factors driving diplomatic tensions, Brazil's strategic concerns, particularly regarding the Essequibo crisis, the main topic on this meeting today, and a broader impact of Venezuelan migration in South America. Additionally, I will outline Brazil's diplomatic approach and discuss possible scenarios for the future. Understanding this evolving situation is crucial, as it not only affects bilateral relations, but also influences Brazil's roles as a regional leader and mediator in South America. The relationship between Brazil and Venezuela has experienced significant shifts in the past 2 decades, influenced by political change and regional dynamics. This transformation can be, on my point of view, divided into 3 different phases. I would call the first phase during the government of Lula I and II, 2003 to 2010, and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Brazil and Venezuela strengthened ties through strategic partnership on political affinity and the goals of fostering South American integration. This period saw the signing of trade agreements, investments in regional hive structure and consolidating of Mercosur, culminating in the Venezuela's accessions to the bloc in 2012 under President Dilma Rousseff. The second phase, during the administration of Jair Bolsonaro and Nicolas Maduro, was marked by diplomatic rupture. Bolsonaro took a confrontational instance against the Venezuelan government, recognizing Juan Guaidó as an interim president and closing the Brazilian embassy in Caracas. Diplomatic relations were effectively severed, and Venezuela migration crisis became a pressing issue in Brazilian politics. It's interesting to say that in Bolsonaro's when Bolsonaro won, part of the speech was that Brazil wouldn't become a Venezuela. No, just to give you an idea of what Venezuela meant to Bolsonaro's government. The third phase began with Lula's return to the presidency in 2023, marked by an initial attempt to re-engagement with Venezuela. Brazil resumed dialogue with Maduro and reintegrated Venezuela into regional forums. However, two recent developments stained relations once again. First one, Maduro's referendum on Essequibo, already spoken today in this meeting, and also the Venezuela's 2024 presidential election. In December 2023, the Venezuelan government held a referendum on the annexation of Essequibo region, currently under Guyanese control, raising international concern. Brazil firmly opposed any military escalation, emphasizing the need of peaceful resolution. Additionally, Venezuela's 2024 presidential election faced an scrutiny from international organizations. Lula, while cautious, made critical remarks regarding to the Venezuela's government authoritarian tendency. This stance led to the withdrawal of Venezuela's ambassador from Brazil and further strained diplomatic relations. A further sign of deterioration was Brazil's decision to veto Venezuela's entry into the BRICS group. While Maduro sought to expand his influence in international forums, Brazil, historically positioned as a mediator, opted to block Venezuela's participation, reinforcing the diplomatic distance between these two nations. Well, what about Brazil's concern over the Essequibo crisis? Brazil has strategic reasons to be concerned about the escalating dispute between Venezuela and Guyana. Beyond the risk of regional destabilization, the crisis threatens President Lula's vision of rebuilding South America as an integrated geopolitical bloc. A military conflict could deepen existing divisions and hinder regional cooperation efforts. Another major concern is the potential for uncontrolled surge in migration. Venezuela's economic and political crisis has already forced millions to seek refuge in neighboring countries, including Brazil. A worsening of this situation could place addiction strain, especially to Roraima, the state just bordering Guyana and Venezuela. The Venezuela migration crisis is one of the most significant displacement events in Latin America in the recent history. In Brazil, to give an idea, between 2015 and 2024, more than 500,000 Venezuelans entered Brazil. To give you another idea, in 2024 alone, Brazil recorded 200,000 new migrants. Half of it were Venezuelans. Well, overall, more than 7 million Venezuelans have left the country in the recent years. Brazil's position on international conflict. Brazil has traditionally prioritized diplomacy over direct military involvement in international conflict, and its approach to the Venezuela-Guyana crisis reflects this historical position. The Brazilian government continues to advocate for diplomatic dialogue and has approached with regional organizations such as CELAC, UNASUR, to prevent military escalation. Well, for this meeting, I have outlined 3 possible scenarios ranging from less to more predictable outcomes about Brazilian position. These scenarios are built upon the diplomatic profile of the current government and Brazil's historical foreign policy approach. To share my screen, here I have to put it here, and then please, let me see. Here we are. Please let me know if you are you can see the screen. Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's start from the scenario 3. Brazil adopts a passive stance and remains neutral. It's the less likely, but possible if the government avoids direct involvement. In this scenario, Brazil would adopt a minimalist and pragmatic approach, avoiding taking sides and limiting its action to diplomatic rhetoric. This approach could occur if, first, the Lula administration believes that deeper involvement in the crisis would bring more cost than benefits for Brazil. The conflict remains in low intensity with no direct military actions, and Brazil prioritizes domestic political stability and seeks to avoid diplomatic friction while rebuilding its foreign policy credibility. In this case, Brazil could maintain a generic diplomatic stance, emphasizing the need for a peaceful solution without committing to either side, avoiding imposing sanctions or veto against Venezuela to keep diplomatic channel open, and increase the monitoring of the Roraima border, but refrain from making explicit move against Caracas. Well, this less likely scenario could be perceived as a sign of weakness, undermining Brazil's ability to influence regional stability. Let's see the scenario 2. Brazil hardens its stance against Maduro and strengthens alliance with Guyana and Western partners. It's a possible scenario if Venezuela takes aggressive actions against Guyana. If Venezuela adopts a more aggressive stance, such as military movements in the Essequibo region, Brazil may be pressured to take a firmer position against Maduro. This could happen due to factors such as concern about regional stability, aiming to prevent a military conflict near Brazilian borders, pressure from the United States and the European Union, which have already criticized Maduro's government and may demand a stronger response from Brazil. Third, defending the international order, since Guyana has the backing of the International Court of Justice in the Essequibo dispute. In this context, Brazil could strengthen ties with Guyana, including possible joint military exercise along the border to demonstrate its commitment to the region stability, align with international sanctions against Venezuela if the conflict escalates, further limited diplomatic relations with Maduro, reinforcing the ongoing distance between these two governments. And the last thing I would like to stress in this scenario is the stance that would mark a shift in Brazilian foreign policy, signing a definitive break with Maduro. However, Lula might resist this path to avoid aligning too closely with the US interest in the region nowadays with under Trump's government. Well, the last scenario, and the most likely, Brazil as an active mediator and regional peacemaker. In this scenario, Brazil takes an active mediating role, seeking to prevent military escalation and reinforcing its position as a regional leader in South America, based on its diplomatic tradition of non-intervention and peaceful conflict resolution. The Brazilian government could, first, promote direct dialogue through UNASUR, CELAC, or CARICOM, work with multilateral organizations such as UN or OAS, avoiding explicit alignment with either side while reinforcing the need to respect sovereignty and international law, applying pressure on Venezuela to prevent unilateral actions, take diplomatic steps to minimize the crisis' impact on regional integration, which is a priority for current Lula's administration. And the last thing I would stress that is this approach would reinforce Brazil's image as a reliable and stabilizing actor in South America, maintaining its strategy of non-military involvement. Well, thank you very much. Hope I have contributed to the discussions, and I will be open to any questions.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Muito obrigado. We are pleased to have with us a distinguished legal practitioner, Senior Counsel Ralph Ramkaran, who has been Guyana's facilitator of the Good Office process on the UN Secretary General since 1994 and remained in that position until the process came to an end. He's currently a member of the Ministerial Advisory Process, and he was the Speaker of the National Assembly in Guyana between 2001 and 2011. And it gives me great pleasure in asking Mr. Ramkaran, Senior Counsel, to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the invitation to speak this evening. And thank you very much, distinguished friends, for your attendance. If you inquire about my presence here, It's only based on the fact that I have been around the Venezuela issue since 1994, when I was appointed the Guyana representative to the United Nations Good Officer process. And I've been hanging about the Venezuela issue for since that time. When the government changed in 2015, the minister, Mr. Carl Greenidge, invited me to continue my association with the Venezuela matter, and I'm at the present time also, along with him, under his chairmanship, a member of the informal Ministerial Advisory Committee on Venezuela. At the present time, Venezuela presents an existential threat to Guyana as a viable state. An invasion by Venezuela of Essequibo will leave Guyana with 1/3 of the territory we now have and no mineral resources or an oil industry. Guyana will become a rump state. Guyana will become a rump state, its richest 2/3 on maritime space in the hands of Venezuela, and still threatened by Suriname, whose foreign minister has now been recently elected, has now been elected as the head of the OAS, which hitherto has played a very powerful role for Guyana in the OAS. Venezuela's aggressive posture, disguised before the Maduro period behind a cloud of platitudinous tributes to peace and friendship, always stood exposed by the invasion of our half of the Ankoko Island in 1966, before the ink was dry on the Geneva Agreement. Having accepted the arbitral award of 1989 for 60+ years, then rejecting it in 1962, Guyana has gone overboard in trying to resolve the controversy it signed by the Geneva Agreement, which it signed in 1966. Guyana agreed and said, you have a problem, let's discuss it. In relation to the Venezuelan position now, where they claim, and I'll read a passage to you in a moment, they claim that the territory belongs to them and there is no scope for any kind of discussion. Under the Geneva Agreement, which established, the Geneva Agreement had two elements. One, the mixed commission, and the second one was Article 33 of the UN Charter. It provided for the mixed commission to sit for 4 years, and if there was no agreement by the mixed commission after the 4 years, the parties can then resort to Article 33 of the United Nations Charter. And that article provides for various means of resolution, including a judicial settlement. The mixed commission did not arrive at a result because Venezuela failed to provide any evidence for its argument that the arbitral award was null and void. As a result of Venezuela's failure, the mixed commission ended without any conclusion. The parties then signed the Protocol of Port of Spain in 1970, which postponed any consideration of the dispute for 12 years until 1982. The protocol, however, provided for the parties to discuss relations and to try to build their relations with each other. The protocol of Spain was not renewed at the instance of Venezuela, but it's interesting to note that just before the protocol was to be renewed, then, I think it was by then President Burnham, no, Prime Minister Burnham made a visit to Venezuela, and which periodically occurred between Guyana and Venezuela. The heads of government or heads of state visited to keep relations going. And just as the discussions between the two countries were good, mutually satisfactory, and when Burnham left Venezuela, the president of Venezuela, Herrera Campins, announced the next day that the Venezuelan government, in a hostile statement, that the Venezuelan government will not renew the Protocol of Port of Spain and will not agree to the Guyana establishing the hydropower project in the Upper Mazaruni. Relations then did not resume. Relations in relation to the border controversy did not progress until towards the end of the Hoyt administration, when the United Nations Secretary General, I think it's about 89 or 90, the United Nations Secretary General offered his good offices and appointed a good officer. There were 3 good officers, starting with Alistair McIntyre. The last was Professor Norman Girvan, who was appointed sometime towards the end of the Jagdeo administration. By the end of the Jagdeo administration, the government of Guyana had begun to contemplate a reference of the matter to the International Commission of Jurists. And because the matter was not going anywhere, the good officer process was not going anywhere. And for many years, Venezuelans had objected to any investment taking place in the Essequibo. They had approached investors, and whatever they threatened them, whatever they told them, we believe they threatened them not to invest in the Essequibo region. So this was a very serious obstacle to Guyana's development. So the government then began to think about approaching the International Commission of Jurists. The good officer process never resumed after that. And by the time the administration changed in 2015, it became clear to the new administration that the good officer process had come to an end and new initiatives needed to be taken. They approached the Secretary General with the intention of seeking a reference of the matter to the International Commission of Jurists. And the Secretary General then suggested an enhanced mediation process, which took effect for 2 years. And that enhanced mediation process, which saw intense discussions between Guyana and Venezuela, especially towards the end of the process, resulted in no resolution of the matter. The Guyana government then formally asked the UN Secretary General to refer the matter to the International Commission of Jurists, which he did in 2018. Now, International Court of Justice. facing certain defeat at the ICJ, Venezuela's posture towards the border issue changed. It intensified its propaganda that the Geneva Agreement had revoked the arbitral award, and that the Geneva Agreement mandates direct negotiations between Guyana and Venezuela. Now, the Geneva Agreement is a very short document, 4 pages, and it's online. And there, if you look at it, there is nothing in the agreement that provides for direct negotiations between Guyana and Venezuela, except in the mixed commission. That's the only place that discussions are provided for. And upon the failure of the mixed commission, or upon the end of 5 years, after there is no conclusion in the mixed commission, there is no provision for any further negotiation. As the process at the ICJ continued, so has Venezuela's aggression. They built a bridge. Well, first first Venezuela called for the establishment of a state of Guyana Essequibo. They changed their laws. They had an organic law, and in that organic law, they provided as follows: the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela will not submit to dispute resolution mechanism by third parties, including arbitrations and the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, matters related to its independence and territorial integrity. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela will use the procedural means available to reject the claims of any court, or Venezuela will use the tribunal, including arbitral tribunals and the International Court of Justice, to attribute jurisdiction to hear to resolve matters related to its independence and territorial integrity. Its independence and territorial integrity, including, which presumably includes Essequibo. That reminds me of many decades ago, myself and a young brilliant foreign affairs officer named Neville Bisemba went to Suriname, sent by the government of Guyana, to discuss the Suriname border issue. And when we sat, after the meeting, when we sat the commencement of the meeting, the gentleman wanted to know why we were there. And when we explained that our governments have agreed for us to meet to discuss the border, the Suriname Foreign Affairs official said, "But what border? The New River Triangle is our territory. There's nothing to discuss." And that of course, brought the meeting to an end. Well, this is what Venezuela is saying, that there's nothing to discuss. Venezuela belongs to us. And with that, Venezuela's belligerence has intensified. They have built military installations on Ankoko. They have built a bridge to Ankoko. They have expanded their military personnel in the area. They have built these military installations, and they have held the referendum, which you have heard about, to incorporate Guyana, or incorporate Essequibo as its 24th state. Guyana approached the ICJ for provisional measures, which was granted. The ICJ ruled that Venezuela and Guyana, of course, are not to take any steps which would interfere with Guyana's administration of the area. Of course, Venezuela continued with its activity, and then the parties met shortly after at Argyle in St. Vincent and came away with the Argyle Declaration. Now, the Argyle Declaration provided, the ICJ provided, let me read the order for you, the ICJ in the provisional, provisional measure. It does in December 2023. It ordered that the parties refrain from taking any action which would modify the situation that currently prevails in the territory in dispute, whereby the Cooperative Republic of Guyana administers and exercises control over the area. Then we had the Argyle Declaration, because Venezuela continued its activity. And the Argyle Declaration provided that the parties must maintain peace. And shortly after the Argyle Declaration, Venezuela has done two things. It has announced an election for a governor and officials in the area it calls Guyana Essequibo, which is the Essequibo region, and it has sent a warship in our exclusive economic zone to intimidate the ExxonMobil and Guyana, of course, who are engaged in oil production. Guyana has once again applied for provisional measures in relation to the elections that Venezuela has called, and is asking the ICJ to restrain Venezuela from conducting elections, from extending the right to vote in the Essequibo region, from distributing ballot papers and other material, from presenting, naming, or supporting candidates for elections, for establishing polling stations and other offices, from purporting to elect a governor, deputies, and other officials, from communicating with residents in the Essequibo with regard to planned elections, from taking any action to annex de jure or de facto any territory on Guyana's side of the boundary, and to refrain from taking any action which would seek to modify the situation that now prevails. Hopefully that hearing will be held before May the 25th, when the elections are due to take place, and hopefully Guyana will get a positive decision. Ladies and gentlemen, Venezuela has embarked on escalatory, adventuristic, aggressive, and hostile activities against Guyana, which, unless they're stopped in their tracks, can lead inevitably and inexorably to the egregious violation of Guyana's territorial integrity in a major way. In this regard, the statement of Secretary of State of the United States, Marco Rubio, is welcome and will go a far way in giving Venezuela second thoughts. But for Guyana, the campaign against Venezuela's manifestly hostile intent against Guyana must be conducted on a multiplicity of fronts. It cannot be confined to one friend, however powerful that friend may be. Resources must be devoted to a permanently established body in the foreign ministry or elsewhere, engaged in mobilizing the Guyanese people by way of education, and promoting popular mass activity by all patriotic forces in the society who are willing to undertake this activity. A team appointed by the government comprising relevant forces in the society under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs must be constantly in the air, visiting capitals, meeting government and state officials in a wide variety of countries, speaking to their print and TV, media, educational institutions, civil bodies and other organizations. The government itself must expand its direct activities in relation to sister governments in the region and further afield. When Mr. Greenidge speaks, he will tell you how difficult it is to maintain a state of affairs while new officials are appointed, officials are changed, ministers are changed, and then you have to continue this process. So you go and you visit one country and you speak to the officials. You need to go back the following year and speak to the new officials who have emerged in the process, because they all have different nuances, they all have different ideas, and they all have to be brought back into focus on what Venezuela is doing. Many countries tell you, you must talk to Venezuela. They do not understand and do not realize, and these new officials tell you, why don't you talk? Venezuela wants talks. They're asking you to talk. But we've been talking for 25 years, and nothing has happened. Venezuela has obstructed the development of the Essequibo region. Venezuela is now terrorizing the people who are producing oil. So how much more are we going to talk? It would surprise you to know that in the 90s, when I began this process, Venezuelan officials used to apologize for their country demanding 2/3 of Guyana. And they said, you know, it will blow over, it will pass over, this thing will fade out, it will disappear with time. That hasn't happened. And Guyana, therefore, must ensure that the work of defending our territory continues. It is the job of every one of us. And unless we do so, Venezuela is developing a momentum which can become unstoppable unless we understand and act on that understanding. And this is the most serious and important threat to the survival of Guyana, which we must take seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramkuran, for sharing your perspectives with us. Finally, we have Mr. Carl Greenidge, an economist by training, who really needs no introduction, but he has been engaged in policy formulation and articulation for several years, and has served as Minister of Finance and Vice President and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and is currently Guyana's agent at the ICJ. It is my pleasure to invite Mr. Carl Greenidge to give us a presentation.
Many thanks, Dr. Curtin. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, good evening. And let me also take the opportunity to thank you all for leaving your comfortable homes and other places of repose to join us to exchange ideas on this particular dilemma that faces Guyana today. Let me start by saying to you I think a lot of people we approach, certainly outside of Guyana, have difficulty understanding the nature of the problem that faces us. And I get the impression that Guyanese themselves don't fully grasp. Well, it's obvious to them a country is demanding your space with all the consequences. But it isn't understood why it is that there is such difficulty bringing that process to a halt or reversing it. And I think it's important that that is understood. The interface between ourselves and our international partners is one that turns on an appreciation of the danger and the urgency. When you look around the world, yes, there are many countries, there are many instances where a country's territory is claimed by another. And there are processes set out in the very UN Charter, Article 33, that is captured in the Geneva Agreement, which Venezuela so often has resort to, or claims that we are not respecting. The steps set out there in the Geneva Agreement are steps that we have actually exhausted. If I might go back to the Geneva Agreement itself, and perhaps it's sometimes helpful for laymen to set these things out. We have distinguished lawyers amongst us who have worked with these things over the years. But I think the challenge is something like this. The two sides agreed a mechanism to clear the problems that weren't cleared in 1966. In 66, they were supposed, in the British eyes, to resolve the problems that Venezuela thought somehow they missed. In the Venezuelan eyes, it may be that that's what they thought at the beginning, but most certainly, as Ralph was pointing out, you now find a situation in which, and this is what happened in 2015 when we met General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, we were being told that the Geneva Agreement itself, and I have brought some copies, because it's so short, and the assertion is so absurd that I think you have to look at it for yourself. It is an agreement which has some specific goals, and it's really set out right at the beginning. The goals are really to enable the countries to deal with what was called a controversy. In other words, you will find when you read, I don't have enough for everyone, but see what you can do with those, please. The goals, sorry, the purpose of the exercise here is to allow the countries, the two countries, to reflect on the difficulties. Oh, sorry. I'm afraid of the code there in my head. I'm now discovering why men should not lose their hair. Because if you wander out in the sun, you suddenly discover that it can be punishingly hot standing in the sun. and it is the other end of the temperature spectrum standing right here at the moment. So forgive me. Now, the thing is, the Geneva Agreement itself is being suggested by the Venezuelans that this agreement is proof that the two sides have agreed that the 1899 award is invalid. So one side is saying the award is invalid. The other side said, but in 66, what we agreed was if we couldn't agree on the means, that is, you will see that in Article 4, we couldn't agree on the means of dealing with the difficulties that were raised as to whether Venezuela was right about allegations about not being properly consulted and so forth. The two parties will discuss the matter, and in the event that they can't agree, the Secretary General will choose the next means from Article 33 of the UN Charter, which has the options, mediation. It doesn't actually mention good offices, but good offices, I think, seems to be the mechanism managed by the Secretary General within which or from which you can choose one of the means. I hope that's clear to you. The issue isn't so much the 6 or 7 means that are set out. The issue is this problem in which one party is saying, we expect you, that is Guyana saying to Venezuela, we expect you to speak to us and demonstrate what it is that you think has caused, or why you're saying that the award of 1899 is null and void. That is the only problem. It was Guyana that asked the Secretary General in the meeting made reference to by Ralph a minute ago. We had asked the Secretary General, and in the end, after the enhanced mediation process, a process of negotiation in which Venezuela had claimed they have options to offer to Guyana. When they look at these options, Guyana will surely agree and a route forward will be found. Of course, no such offer was made because it only involved a demand that we give up all or most of the Essequibo. And for that reason, that process couldn't go anywhere. The SG therefore decided that the matter would go to the court. The definition of what the court was asked to do was set out in our memorial 2018. And in essence, what that memorial asked the court to do was to decide whether the 1899 award was still valid. And if it is still valid, the court must impress upon the parties that their responsibilities that arose from the decision of 1899 still apply now. The borders are set out in the 1899 agreement. They are not set out in the Geneva Agreement, which is one of the things that we don't have the time. But I was listening earlier today to a statement by President Maduro, in which he was saying 2 or 3 things. One of them is that the Geneva Agreement is the only means by which this matter can be solved, and it actually sets out obligations for Guyana, which Guyana doesn't respect. If you look in here, if you look in the document I gave you, it makes absolutely no mention of Essequibo. It makes absolutely no mention to the transfer of land, which is what Venezuela is insisting that this is what we have to be discussing. So although there are a whole set of means or mechanisms mentioned, they are actually not being exploited in any way, because the problem that when we meet to discuss things bilaterally, those things don't arise. I wonder whether I'm making sense to you. The court is being asked, because none of these things have worked, because the Secretary General of the UN, Doug Newlander from Norway and so forth, could not bring us together to resolve the problem, this question of whether we should be looking at whether the agreement is null and void or not null and void, how we should resolve or prove the nullity. It was decided to send the matter to the court. We didn't go there unilaterally as Guyana. It was a decision by the SG, and that decision is as set out in the very Geneva Agreement that is here. So we are before the court. The court's being asked about nullity. It's not being asked about maritime zone. It's not relevant to the maritime zone directly. It has implications for access to the zone. And so I just want to draw to your attention that it's a simple document. If it has any complicated part, it has to do with the mixed commission, and that phase is dead. The mixed commission lasts 4 years. The 4 years have gone. They ended in 1970, and we are now required to persuade the court that the criteria for nullity have been met or have not been met. That is what the court has been asked to do today. Venezuela has sought always not to have that particular matter addressed. As Ralph was saying earlier, in '66, they did not bring any information to establish whether or not or why they thought the award was null and void. At this point in time, that has to be established before the court. And it is fairly clear. I was making reference to the video that I was looking at by President Maduro. It is fairly clear that the case that Venezuela has is extremely weak. I mean, I don't want to judge for the court, but I'm saying to you, if you argue, as has been argued in some of the documents of Venezuela, that throughout the 18th and 19th century, the culture of Essequibo was Spanish. That's what was actually said in the documents. And that the space was controlled, or there was colonization of the space by Spanish speakers. I mean, there are many dimensions of this that are ridiculous. Spain itself has never claimed the territory that is Essequibo. The Spanish presence was on the other side, west of the Cuyuni River, where the problems last week and a couple of weeks ago were taking place. Not in Essequibo per se. The Venezuelan case before the 1899 arbitral award, in a sense, was a reasonable one. And that would explain the US involvement. Let me tell you what that is. Venezuela saw that British and its settlers were expanding into the Orinoco, the river Orinoco. And as the manager of the space that is Venezuela, they were very interested in ensuring that they kept control over the territory that is the estuary of the Orinoco, because the estuary controls the movement of trade in this part of the world. It's one of the most important trade routes, and especially since the Panama Canal was constructed, the movement of goods in particular is heavily influenced by the Orinoco itself. And therefore, they were able to go to the United States. This is part of the irony of the story. They went to the United States arguing that the US should keep the British out of the area because the British want, like many other Europeans, to dominate the space, and domination of the space was a problem for all Latin America and South America. And the first Secretary General they approached said, why are you asking us to enforce the Monroe Doctrine? Why are you asking the US to enforce the Monroe Doctrine? Are you going to expect us to come to your rescue every time you have a problem with a European country? That's where that debate started. It is ironic. It's ironic because today, Venezuela is accusing the United States of stealing the territory for Guyana, when in fact it is they who brought the US into the process. The US was a reluctant participant until such time as they saw advantages, which included investments that had taken place on the Orinoco itself. But the real point I'm wanting to make is that the debate was over the Orinoco. The debate and the decision of the court was to ensure that the Orinoco and control access, strategic access to the Orinoco was given to Venezuela rather than Britain. So the importance of certainly of Point Playa in the extreme north, in the extreme northwest, the Barima Point, which loomed very large, as a place having control of the Orinoco, and so forth. These things, these decisions taken by the arbitral panel were in response to that demand by Venezuela, which was regarded as reasonable. This is the Orinoco drains roughly 2/3 of Venezuela. It is an important river in the same way that Essequibo drains a similar proportion of Guyana's landmass. And therefore, they got, in a sense, what they asked for, if I may put it that way. The Orinoco is Venezuelan now. It was given to them by the court. The river was where it is now physically, but it was part of a territory that the British were controlling the eastern side of the Orinoco River at that time. Settlement, British settlement, yes, British settlers were in the Orinoco, and this is part of the contention about the survey work that was being done. But I don't want to spend more on the history. I just really want to say to you that this is what they asked for. The issue of Essequibo was not a significant issue. If you were faced, and Guyanese get upset, I think, when I say this, if you were faced with a choice between the Orinoco and the Essequibo, you have to be mad to choose the Essequibo. The Orinoco is a vastly longer river. It is a deep river, and unlike all the rivers in Guyana, you can travel for almost its entire length with a boat that has a draft that is significant. Every 2 feet in the Berbice River, and I'm sorry that Berbice gets mixed up with these other places, but every 2 feet in the Demerara River or in the Essequibo River, you bump into rocks and rapids and so forth. So that was why this eastern side from the Orinoco was of not great significance to Venezuela. Their interest was to capture and get the world to endorse their control of that river. And I'm going to say to you that other people, the same people I was mentioning at the beginning, who are asking about why should a country which is so much larger than Guyana, which has 200 billion barrels of oil known to be, if you like, in reserve, why would they be fighting for a place that has 11? Yes, it could be greed, but I don't think so somehow. It could be greed. There is a strategic dimension to this. And the strategic dimension is important to a country that is ambitious. If you look at Venezuela's history over the years, Venezuela has been exceedingly close to the United States throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Very, very, very close. And their concern in that relationship with the US was to ensure that the Caribbean islands, which had, at that time, 1960, the Caribbean islands, such as Cuba and the others, could be seen as posing a threat in terms of having a capacity to land radicals, militants, armed forces on Venezuela's coast. And therefore, they had an interest in ensuring that that possibility was minimized. But Venezuela itself didn't have a military capacity to look after its entire coast. And for that reason, it needed the US. The US, Chavez, it is said, suggested, well, he did say that it's the US that came with this idea of laying claim to the Essequibo so that it can serve as a sort of cordon sanitaire, a space between socialist islands and pure, politically pure Venezuela. But the point is, to the extent that Venezuela was a partner to the US, it was quite happy to work. It was quite happy to work in that context. After 2000, 2007, and the death of Chavez, you have a different situation. And that, I think, you have to understand. If you, for example, look at the Essequibo River and how Guyana was explored, you will find that without the Essequibo, it would have taken us a much longer time than it actually has to be able to explore and populate the south and southeastern parts of Guyana in particular. It's key to access, it's key to the colonization of the Rupununi and the south of Guyana. That is the point I'm trying to make. If you are able to control the Essequibo, you also have access to Suriname. The extreme south of Guyana is quite close to Suriname. So for Venezuela, that gives them the prospect of being able, because if you're controlling Essequibo, Demerara and Berbice are at Essequibo's mercy in effect, but maybe not to the same extent as Suriname, but it provides Essequibo with a strategic access. It provides whoever controls Essequibo to strategic access to Guyana. The furthest point south on the Essequibo River is only a few miles from Suriname. So without having to go on the Cortina or the Berbice River, you can get to Suriname. So there's a strategic obsession with Venezuela in the same way that it claims it needs access to the Atlantic, maritime access to the Atlantic. Venezuela has a coast. It's the longest of the Caribbean coasts. It is the longest Caribbean coast. It has the longest Caribbean coast. Why then is it fighting Guyana down for a piece of coast which is not even Caribbean? It's an Atlantic coast. That affords us access to the Atlantic. But Venezuela, of course, has a right to utilize the Atlantic. It has a right to utilize the Atlantic for peaceful purposes. Maybe that's where the problem comes. if you want to send warships out there, you have to notify whoever's in control of the coast. And the idea that somehow Guyana must give them space to have an Atlantic corridor actually makes no sense in normal circumstances. Guyana does not have an Antarctic coast. We have no claims to the Antarctic or to the Arctic Ocean. But we may have ministers that think, well, maybe we should have. But the laws as they are agreed between countries today don't give you right to an ocean unless you have a coast on that ocean. This is where the problem lies. So supposing somebody wakes up one morning and decides, I'd like to be an Antarctic power. Does that mean they can just come and invade you, seize your territory so that they can go in the Antarctic? No. But that apparently is Venezuela's intent. And that is really the challenge. What I'm saying to you is the logical negotiation of a solution for Venezuela and Guyana is not available because Venezuela in the first place has ambitions that have nothing to do with the way the international law is fashioned. You can only have an EEZ and lay claim to an ocean if you have a coast. They would like, as I can share you these maps. They don't quite show that, but you can look at them just now. They would like, notwithstanding the fact that their coast ends west of Guyana, they would like to be able to behave as though they have an Atlantic coast beyond Point de Playa. And to the extent that they have it, they would like Guyana to be without a coast. In other words, the configuration that Venezuela has in mind would give us what President Granger used to call an inverted bikini. It's a, as opposed to the normal triangle, we would not be able to have the Atlantic space. We would have a tiny piece giving us access to the Atlantic. Today, the difficulty of listening to Chavez, to Maduro and his explanation of what the naval vessels were doing within a few miles of Guyana's maritime boundary with Suriname is a little absurd. If you, just let me jump a little bit. The points at which, and this for this you can look at the map, the points at which these, the Exxon vessels intercepted is something like 86 kilometers, 86 kilometers. You have two different maps here. We can start on this side, two sets here. The points that are marked are the points where the vessels were intercepted by the Venezuelans. And the point, what I want to say to you is that Caracas, which lies almost 1,000 miles to the west of that boundary between Guyana and Suriname, is laying claim to a maritime space that far away and so close to Suriname. It is a very, very difficult, thing to really understand or comprehend. But the other observation I'd like to make, some more of these were here. Can you make sense of it? There are the tiny dots that are shown. The square box is the most recent interception. Okay, and that interception is just to the west of the boundary of Guyana and Suriname. Just to the west of the Guyana. Do you have another one left there? Ambassador would like one. The yellow and blue line on the different map? Oh, okay. Those lines show the boundary of the EEZs. Now, the red lines are the boundary. One part of that red line, sorry to jump like this. One part of the red line, the red line to the east, by the rectangle, it's not only that it's our territory, that boundary was set by the UN Law of the Sea Convention. It's not a boundary defined by Guyana. It's a boundary that the UN law, UNCLOS, has set. And yet, Venezuela can come so close to that boundary, which is our boundary as defined by the UN, to claim this territory as theirs. The one to the extreme left is the similar boundary, the western boundary, but it is not being defined by UNCLOS. Guyana and Venezuela have to agree that boundary, and Venezuela, when they had seized the techniques Parana, contended that you must have agreement on the land before you can sort out the sea, which is absolutely true. We agree with that. So we say, in 2011 and 2013, let's talk about the land. Let's talk about the land. But they say there's nothing to talk about the land. The land is ours because it's Essequibo. And that is why the process has not gone anywhere from 2011, 2013. So it is that sort of, sorry. So it's that kind of problem that you have. And if Venezuela believes that it has a justifiable case, it should have no difficulty going to the court. This court, the ICJ, has 16 judges drawn from every geographical area in the world. And where Guyana and Venezuela may feel that the representative isn't going to look after their business, they can appoint a judge ad hoc. They're both appointed judges ad hoc. Why then would you assume that you can't win the case? You can't win the case because you oughtn't to win the case. Your case is weak. That is the issue. And that is why Venezuela insists that the negotiations must be bilateral. If you have a case, why is it so outrageous to have a third party assist in having the dialogue between bilateral parties? You have a difficulty with a third party because you don't want a third party to perhaps hold the ring, hold the ropes to the ring. You want to be able to bully the other side. If I show you a set of tables here, which has incidents, military or what I would call bullying incidents, imposed on Guyana by Venezuela. If you look at the dates, you will recognize the significance. 1966 to 70, they couldn't agree on the and the mixed commission for as regards the how to go forward. And it is at that point you will find that Venezuela now sends troops to the borders. There are all sorts of things happening on the borders. In 2015, when oil was discovered, the reason we went to see the Ban Ki-moon was because you had Venezuelan military vessels in our waters, on our boundaries. What am I saying? I'm saying they call for bilaterals. As soon as the bilaterals are implemented and they can't bully you into agreeing only to talk about handing over Essequibo, they then send the military to soften you up. That has been the pattern. That has been the pattern throughout. And that is why we are at this point where it is likely, I mean, we try not to do it. I don't want to say to you, we can never say we are sure what the court will do. But Venezuela has failed to present a case that could persuade the court. And the two major things that they have brought to the court's attention by way of preliminary objections and the first set of interventions, they failed completely. The court voted 12-4 against them in the first case, and subsequently there was only one vote on behalf of Venezuela. By a court that is not a Caribbean court, by a court that is not a Latin court, a court with it has a Mexican on it now. But there is no reason to assume that the court is inherently against Venezuela for Venezuela's sake, either because Venezuela is radical or anything like that. The same challenges the court faces Venezuela, it would have faced Nigeria, and others who have gone to the court have faced, and they have to make their case. They have to make their case, and you have to be able to put evidence to the court. I don't think Venezuela is short of exceptional lawyers. It is the case that they're short of. The things they're arguing are ridiculous. Just to give you a little piece, many people perhaps don't even know, unless it's your subject area or unless you happen to come upon it coincidentally. Guyana, and I'm not now speaking about the way we speak in the street, Guyana has two historically distinct Creoles. One of them, of course, from Berbice. And that's a peculiar one because it has more. I'm not saying that because I come from Berbice. You're smiling as though you absolutely not related. You have a Creole, which just incidentally has perhaps more African words in it than any other Creole. That is whether it's Portuguese or French Creoles. But you had another Creole, which was, and that is, they're not quite clear how that evolved in Berbice and Kanji. Another Creole peculiar to Essequibo. They were quite different. The vocabulary is quite different. The incidence of African words is different. The Creole on the Essequibo had quite a bit of Dutch in it. But insofar as it had Dutch in it, it was Dutch from Zealandia. Okay? And that is because the places that funded the Dutch West India Company were along that coast, which includes the area that is now Belgium. So there are, and I'm saying to you, no Spanish-based Creole, no Spanish-based Creole has ever existed in Guyana. None whatsoever. And the peculiarities of the Creole, I mean, can you imagine? If you drive along the East Coast, you will find Guyanese variants of French. And I'm sure that if place names could exist after a footprint that would have been down there maybe for 50 years, if that long, because it's mostly French pirates and a few plantation owners from whom those place names arose, including the ones that are in the city. So you can go to Trinidad and Tobago, where Trinidad and Venezuelans would say, well, Spaniards, not Venezuelans, Spaniards were there for 200 years, or 150 years. The language and the Creole and the place names and the people's names reflect that. Any name of any person you find in Guyana who's been here post or pre 2000 that sounds Spanish is likely to be in Portuguese. Place names and people's names. There's continuity, trots. Many of you would know the Trots family. The Dutch television station did a program to try to trace the footprint of the Dutch in Guyana. They found one of the governors, I think it was 1756, Dr. Trots, coming to Guyana. And they found a letter where he wrote, his wife was writing a son who was left with her sister, with his sister. He'd got malaria, and of course, he was misbehaving. So she writes him, I know why you bother, because the letter took months to reach. That one didn't reach because the British seized it on the high seas. But the point is, all of these coincidences, as it were, highlight the point that is being made. Even if you were here for a relatively short time, there would have been a footprint of some kind. You didn't really have Jews here in any numbers. You didn't have Germans here in any numbers. You didn't have French here in very many numbers. But you can find continuity in terms of place names, French place names, Danzig, and all sorts of evidence of a presence. No such Spanish evidence exists. None whatsoever. This makes it difficult for them to have resort to the court. They brought lawyers. In fact, their team is far larger than ours in terms of numbers. And yet, all the issues of consequence they've lost so far. And that is exactly why they are trying to persuade, and again, I go back to the video that I was shown, where President Maduro is insisting that, you must not go to the court. He is busily trying to persuade the world, because they have put a lot of effort into their PR, a lot of money, a lot of resources into their PR to persuade the rest of the world that they shouldn't have to go to the court because it was their land which was seized, and because the court is biased against them. It is pro-American. There's a court that decided in favor of Dominica, was it, against the same forum against the United States. So it is not automatic that they would lose the case because they're radical or socialist or whatever they call themselves. The point is that they have to find evidence to support their case. So our job has been made more difficult by that exercise, because you don't appear to be talking. And there's a reason for this. And that is why we found ourselves in the difficult situation where in 2024, the president of Guyana was pressed into meeting with President Maduro in the company of others, the same third parties that he doesn't want involved. But I will say to you, it's not really a third party. I mean, I'm not casting aspersions on Caribbean colleagues, but most of the members there are members of ALBA, meaning that they are beneficiaries of Venezuelan largesse. So to the extent that you are able to cast your vote in any such discussion, be aware that when you're sending us to a forum like ALBA, it is not a forum that is unbiased. Okay, it is difficult. And the CELAC countries, who traditionally would be sympathetic to Venezuela for reasons that are pretty obvious, not so obvious as reasonable, they are not in a position, and they haven't really been following these cases very closely. I remember being in a CELAC, the first CELAC meeting I attended as minister, and the most senior of the ambassadors of the country was chatting with me and said, but you have to understand the position of the Venezuelans. The court, the arbitral panel, took a decision, and there were no Venezuelans on the arbitral panel. So I asked him why. He said, well, he assumed they were excluded by the British because the British were so powerful. But I have a different explanation. It goes something like this. The same Venezuelans that had asked the Americans to come and persuade Britain to go to arbitration are the same Venezuelans when offered the arrangements for arbitration, which are set out in the 1897 Treaty of Washington. It defines who can choose. They, when given a choice, chose American judges. I know you're going to tell me a lie. They chose American judges, and you would want to ask yourself, and there's the difficulty you have speaking to people that don't know the region and the peculiarities of the region. Why would a Venezuelan choose, well, he may not do it now, but why would he in 1899 choose an American, the Chief Justice no less, or former Chief Justice no less? Not, well, no, I think that they were hoping, just as with the question of persuading Britain. If Britain lost the case, they were pretty sure that Britain would not want to implement the decision. If the arbitral panel ruled mostly against Britain, Britain wouldn't want to implement. So they chose American judges. America was up and coming and causing all sorts of difficulties to Britain as a young Turk. And therefore it was good strategy. You choose American judges, and the American judges would be sympathetic to you. The nonsense written by Severo Mali-Prevost in the claim that there was fraud takes no account of that. It takes no account of the fact that at that time, Russia, which was in the chair, was at loggerheads with Britain. They weren't likely to collude together at that time because they were having difficulties internationally for all sorts of reasons. So I'm saying sometimes, obviously, silly decisions appear to be taken, but when you go underneath, there's a lot of sense to some of the things that were done. And in the case of the arbitration, there's a reason why the arbitration panel seemed to favor Britain. Because there are other things had to be taken into consideration, or were taken into consideration. And supposedly, British deviance didn't, at least it doesn't appear to have lain behind how the decision was taken. But in any case, Venezuela, having participated, accepted the arbitral panel's decision, passed it through their parliament, participated in talks with Brazil to define the tri-junction point on Mount Roraima in 1931, having had discussions going from 1928. All of those things was, Venezuela was party to. You, in other words, ended up with an agreement in which 3 different states helped to define another set of boundaries. And in 2016, Venezuela could come to the court and say, 1, it never agreed to the International Court of Justice being party to any resolution. And if you look at the Geneva Agreement, that clearly is untrue, and the judges who voted or who sought to give minority views didn't say that Venezuela did not agree. What they said is, well, maybe, and this is a minority of judges, maybe the court should have asked Venezuela. But the point is, if the 2 countries, Guyana and Venezuela, have never agreed on a single thing to do with these boundaries after the boundary was drawn. After 1899, the British said, look, the boundary is running through a river here and down a hill, through a village over there. Shall we just shift it and compensate, whoever loses land by the movement of that boundary? Venezuela said no. Absolutely no decision were they prepared to accept. Even the good offices process, in the good offices process, it's the SG who in the end had to opt for a means of breaking a deadlock because the 2 parties couldn't agree. And yet here is Mr. Maduro saying to the world, if only you all would leave us alone to talk to the Guyanese, we will come to an amicable agreement, amicable agreement with the help of the assets of Venezuela. So the difficulty is going to arise. For all of those reasons, the difficulty we have will arise even after the court will have made a decision. And that is why, or that means, that Guyana has to be exceedingly careful and diligent and assiduous in its diplomatic work as you approach the decision that the court is supposed to give and after the court is supposed to give. Contrary to how we sometimes behave, the court decision is not going to be end all of everything. It will enable companies and allies and even enemies to say, well, the border issue is no longer an issue because the court has decided in Guyana's favor. But that doesn't mean that Venezuela is going to give it up. As I said, there are other ambitions. There are other ambitions relevant in relation to this problem, and therefore we can anticipate that work will have to continue on this. I need to apologize for, I didn't even check, for holding you so long. I get very excited when I see attentive audiences. And the talk is about borders. Mr. Chairman, my apologies, but thank you all for being so attentive and patient.
Thank you very much, Brother Greenwich, for that most important, I wouldn't call it overview anymore, but very extensive analysis of the current situation. Now it's your turn. I believe that although we're kind of late in the evening, that we must have a few questions, comments, and recommendations. So I'm going to ask Ryan to, we have one here, over here. Sorry? Yeah, sorry, there's a mic. Give me that, let me give this. We give it to them.
Whilst the questions are coming, I'm going to ask that some more tables go by. I'm accusing you of not enough. These are the Caribbean countries whose exclusive economic zones are claimed by Venezuela. Just so that you know, it's not a Guyana problem. Not a Guyana Venezuela problem.
Hello. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I have a question for the Honorable Carl Greenidge. Mr. Greenidge, could you speak to us on anything called effective occupancy, if that applies, and if it would influence the court's decision in any way? And I had some other questions, but I believe you did answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take one at a time? You want to take one at a time, or?
No, for a round of questions.
Right.
So what happens next? That's my question.
Good evening, sir. Again, two questions. The first, I'm trying to find out the claim for Venezuela. What's the reason for Venezuela's claim to the rights of Essequibo, which is, according to all, whatever the word is, all, agreements, is Guyana's territory. What is the reason for the claim? Am I getting it? It's because they are saying that they had a Spanish DNA in Essequibo, and therefore it's Spanish territory. That's one question. And the other question is, you touched on, when the judgment is going to be made, and hopefully it's going to be soon. Hopefully they can judge on the elections that Venezuela plans for March 25th, before March 25th comes, that they can stop that. But also for the rights to Essequibo by Venezuela. What is the question again? What if it does not go in Guyana favor, for God forbid, and it goes in Venezuela favor? We are looking at it all the time that it's going to go to Guyana, and rightly so, I would say. But what if it goes to Venezuela? What do we do from there? Thank you.
One more, and then we can.
My name is Sharmini Rampasad. I'm an associate fellow of CIBS. So here I'll read just a few lines from called the Melian Dialogue, the Peloponnesian War, written by Thucydides. Athenians, you know as well as we do that when these matters are discussed by practical people, the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel, and in fact, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Melian, you should not destroy a principle that is so to the general good of all men, namely that in the case of all who fall into danger, there should be such a thing as fair play and just dealing. Are we dealing with that today with Guyana and Venezuela? Thank you.
Thank you, Shamji. What perhaps I can do, Mr. Chairman, if you agree, I will give a first, make a first attempt to answer, and you may well find that that some of the others at the front here may have additional comments. I haven't asked, but I don't want to assume they won't. A number of questions were asked. First of all, but you asked what's next. The court will, in its response to the provisional measures we have invoked, as it were, it will presumably sometime in April make a response. And it is aware that to the extent that it takes a long time to answer or to give decisions, and to the extent that Venezuela has already ignored decisions that they have handed down in relation to not jeopardizing the constitutional status of Essequibo, one would assume that the decision, the judgment they'll hand down will be that much firmer and that much clearer. That's all I can say for the time being. After that, the process will continue because we are at a stage that has been suspended. What is supposed to be happening? The court is supposed, having gone through these procedural things, it's supposed to be looking at the merits, what they call the merits of the case. What really are we being asked to decide on as regards nullity? Is the 1899 award null or not? Those details they will address. Venezuela has made a submission, what we call the counter memorial. Guyana has also done something, and then Venezuela has a rejoinder. The court, I don't know how long it will take. It could take 6 to 9 months or maybe even longer to give a decision. So you're speaking of a decision into 2026. Okay? It is long. This is a case that is longer, I think, than most that have gone before them. So that is the time schedule you're looking at. The question of effective occupancy, when a court is asked to decide on, if you like, on borders, they have to look at a number of things before I come to the occupancy itself. And those things have to do with whether the claimant, if I might borrow that term, can show that they were in control of the area, that their people were settled in the area, that their laws governed the area. And the question of occupancy, I think, is related to the issue of colonization, essentially. The two sides had a long discussion about colonization when they were agreeing the Washington Treaty of 1899. The Washington Treaty governed the rules, 1897, governed the rules that would apply in 1899. And there was a demand that the period of occupancy be 70 years. At the time, that seemed to have been fairly common. In other words, if this area is to be given to people as having beneficial occupation, you have to show that they've been occupying it for 70 years. The two sides actually agreed on 50. Okay? However they got there doesn't really matter, but there's two sides agreed. They agreed that in 97, and in making the decision, the arbitral panel used that. As far as I can remember, that is the issue pertaining to effective occupancy. It doesn't mean that, as Venezuela has tended to argue, the Pope in 1493 spoke to this issue of occupying areas that would have been empty. Well, don't let's get into the emptiness, because of course people were there. Much of it was not empty. But having looked at the arguments, that's what the arbitral panel decided as regards the colonization or effective occupation. And to that extent, the different areas that they gave to Venezuela as opposed to Guyana were informed by that. One of the reasons why, for example, they decided that the British settlers in the mouth of the Orinoco would not be able to stay there was that they hadn't been there for the requisite period. Okay? But this is, in a sense, a legal issue, the decision as to how effective occupation is, other than for the length of time. I don't know where there's another dimension to that. Perhaps Ralph may have ideas, or may have dealt with it before. The Pope in 1493, in that papal bull of 1493, there were several of them, but the one in 1493 in particular was relevant to this particular case and supposedly Spain's rights in this area. Papal bulls, treaties between countries, just conquest. There are various means of determining whether or not territory belongs to one country as opposed to another. Spain stuck with the idea of papal bulls for a long time, or the award. But in fact, Venezuela was a colony until 1830. Remember this. It was a colony until 1830. Why am I telling you that? Because the United Provinces, which is the Netherlands, the Dutch, got their independence after an 80-year war with the Spaniards. They got their independence in 1648, which means that the territory was handed over by Spain to the Dutch long before Venezuela even became a colony. Venezuela was given as a grant in 1630 something to Germans. And I'm telling you that just to show you that the two countries didn't really overlap in terms of their constitutional and other arrangements. So Germany was running Venezuela for some time. That's the area around Caracas in particular. In 1648, the Dutch finished their rebellion and were given independence. And the Dutch West India Company had in 1621, prior to independence, started already settling colonies or bringing in colonists into Essequibo since 1631. And therefore, it becomes difficult for you to contend and to do so consistently that Venezuelan colonization preceded. In the early days, of course, and this wasn't so true of the Dutch, the settlements didn't last very long. In those areas in the Cuyuni I was telling you about, both sides of the Cuyuni River, the Capuchin, like Jesuits, who were encouraging settlers to come into these areas, they didn't survive very long because the Indians didn't take very kindly. This is the indigenous Indians, didn't take kindly to Spanish settlements of the areas through their experience. The Dutch somehow seem better able to relate to the indigenous Indians, particularly the Caribs, and therefore the settlement of Spaniards tended to be problematic. Now, if you've seen the film called The Mission, you have any film, you've seen it? Okay. The Mission is a film about Spaniards and Portuguese in an area north. It could have been in an area bordering Guyana or somewhere in the vicinity, but it's Spanish and Portuguese. And what is happening here is that the Portuguese are displacing the Spanish from a certain areas with consequences for the Indians. As part of their mechanism for colonizing effectively areas, they would collect and corral the Indians into a mission. If you've had the privilege of, or not the privilege of seeing Nigeria, where you have churches with thousands of people, big churches, and they gather these people together. The church works on them. They do everything within the church, division of labor between men and women and so forth. This created problems with the Indians. But the point is that many of the indigenous Indians did not find that arrangement of living satisfactory. And although the churches brought hundreds of head of cattle as a means of encouraging the indigenous Indians to come into the missions, they didn't stay. But when they didn't stay, armed men were sent to go round them up, collect them, and bring them back. And the story of the mission is about what befell these people either in the missions or when they left the missions. And funnily enough, it ended, if I might just say, it ended with a situation in which, or it began in a situation where some Indians find some musical instruments floating on the river, something like that. Do you remember that part? It was a cultural novelty for them. What is this technology? They pick it up, they blow the recorder or whatever it was, and in that way, the settlers were able to perhaps build a confidence. When the rampage of Spaniards and Portuguese was finished, some Indians, again, wandering their lands, they found artifacts left behind. And the only thing that they picked up, again, was a woodwind instrument cast aside somewhere. In other words, I mean, there are moral lessons in the film, which isn't really relevant to us here. I'm just saying to you that after all of this intense attempt to Christianize and to make these people comfortable with Western culture, you had done them so much damage that in the end, they didn't see much left after you had killed off many of them, because it involved a lot of people being killed, a lot of blood and so forth. Incidentally, Mr. Maduro, just a little bit, sorry. Maduro spoke of the blood and swords of Venezuelans in capturing Essequibo. I can say without any chance of contradiction that Essequibo was never, ever the subject of any Venezuelan military excursion to rescue them from anyone. It is another fabrication. The truth is that the independence of Essequibo, insofar as it threw off colonial yokes, it was an African Indian struggle against the British, and it didn't take place until after the death of Simon Bolivar, who he was saying, this is the man that helped to liberate. Bolivar may have liberated Latin America. I have no difficulty with that. He had absolutely nothing to do. He never went to the Essequibo. He had nothing whatsoever to do with the liberation of Essequibo and its inhabitants. Nothing whatsoever. He was dead by 1830. The 1834, well, you had 1823, thousands of slaves rebelled against the British. There were no Spaniards involved. And by the time you get to 1834, and Damon, what's his name, was dead, Simon Bolivar, and this was a struggle involving 700, something like 700 slaves. The place where these slaves were rounded up was a place called La Belle Alliance. I don't know that to be Spanish. La Belle Alliance. It was on the Essequibo coast. Essequibo coast. And it didn't involve any Spaniards coming to the assistance of the slaves. The road which they tried to rename Simon Bolivar Highway runs outside of the church La Belle Alliance. Okay. The Captaincy General of Venezuela. Well, this is just a domestic reorganization on the Spanish side, but bear in mind that by 1777, the Napoleonic Wars, you started on a whole series of wars, ended in the Napoleonic Wars, in which Guyana was moved from one to the other. None of those switches of colonial powers involved Spain. The British, the French, and the English are the colonizers the territory transferred. So the idea that 1777 Captaincy General gave Essequibo and parts of Guyana to Venezuela is false. My own discussions with the researchers in the Netherlands who have now taken an interest in what was happening in this part of the world suggest that they are now starting to publish, and you will see a number of them, including the one that dealt with Trotz, the Director General Trotz, whose son was written to by his wife and so forth. You will find publications on those. And Professor Kars was here last year from the US, Dutch by descent, and did something on what she called the 1763 revolution, explaining the alliances between Indians and Africans, amongst Africans, the difficulties between the different groups consolidating. Charity, if I might turn to your question or comment, I don't know that was a question. The truth is, I embrace the dialogue completely. I think the pointer that it flags, or the issue it flags, is a very important one, and that is as applicable in the circumstances that we face here as it was in the medieval period.
Okay, I think I think we're getting a bit late, so I'm going to ask each of the other presenters just to have a minute to wrap up if you would like to make any comment. A minute each.
All right. Good night once again. Continuing my perspective, and I thank Mr. Curtin for the invitation. It has been very insightful for me as a student to sit amongst this distinguished panel here tonight, this evening. I've learned quite a lot, taken away from this, and especially from a historical point of view. A lot of uncertainties for me was clarified in his presentation tonight. So I thank you for the invite. From a youth perspective, though, I think that more engagement from that point of view is needed on the matter, because we don't want the wrong narrative of the situation to continue to be peddled from one side, misleading the truth of the nature of the dispute. So if in any part that this engagement could be fostered from a youth perspective, I would encourage that. I thank you once again.
Thank you very much for your participation. Mr. Ramkaran?
Well, thank you very much for coming. I just want to say that, talk has always been, if only we can get the Americans on our side, if only we can get the Americans to land soldiers here, or if we can get the Americans to put a base here, that will solve the problem. Well, the Americans have done pretty close to that. With a recent statement by Marco Rubio, he mentioned the Navy, and I think there's an implicit threat there that if Venezuela were to interfere with Guyana's territory, the U.S. will send its Navy to finish them off. That's not going to solve the problem. I think the message needs to get out from here that we need to continue our own struggle, our diplomatic efforts, our local educational mobilization efforts, and those have to be continued consistently. And as we are beginning to recognize, and we must continue to recognize, this work has to continue after the decision of the ICJ, assuming that the ICJ rules in our favor. So this process has to go on forever. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, before we leave, I would like to thank, first of all, the presenters, both here in person and online, to thank you for coming and staying on with us. We at the Center for International and Border Studies, we plan to have a series of these engagements, both locally and hopefully regionally. And we look forward to the support, not only from the state, but from other agencies who must come on board with us. And we look forward to your continued contributions to the greater understanding of the issues. Once again, thank you very much, and we really appreciate your presence. And have a good night. Safe travel home.